The views expressed on this podcast are ours alone and do not reflect the views of our employers.
Evolution of Evil.
I'd have the sleeping pill mixture already prepared. Person would drink it, fall asleep. That's when they would be strangled.
Do you have a boyfriend?
No.
You never told me your name.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
Evil is not spurned. Evil is thought of as a spirit that needs help.
Believe me, if I started murdering people, there'd be none of you left.
Evolution of Evil.
Hello there, and welcome to the True Crime Podcast, Evolution of Evil, the show where we relive some of the more awful and horrific crimes while also diving into the human psyche that makes these crimes possible. Please remember to subscribe and rate this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Follow the show on Twitter at Evolution of EVI2, as well as us. He is at Justin Yent. I am at T Stevens 91. So last week we started the kickoff show. I did Bell Gunnis right here, the Pride and Joy of LaPorte, Indiana, killed over 40 people. And this week we're going down by you, down in the Florida ways. We're going to be doing Danny Rawling, a.k.a. the Gainsville Ripper, which this takes place in August of 90. And what I like about the show is I know nothing about him. And you're gonna tell us. So, but we one thing we never really got into in the first episode, which is important, is what interests us in this. So, how did you get your toe in the waters of true crime and serial killers?
Well, since I was a little kid, I've always wondered what makes someone take another's life on purpose. Someone born evil, or do they evolve into evil over time? In this new podcast, I think we will explore and try to answer those questions, studying some of the world's most notorious killers. But I grew up fascinated by murder mysteries and ever so popular with whodunit mystery shows. I used to watch it with my nanny in Gainesville, actually. We always used to attempt to solve the crime before the villain or the villains were revealed to the audience. And so it just became a game to us, right? And so I just loved it. When I was a young kid, I was introduced to evil through a couple of local murders, one specifically that we'll cover on this episode of Evolution of Evil, the Gainesville murders. Due to my fascination with murder mysteries and the exposure to murder as a child, I knew exactly what degree I wanted in college. So just recently, I obtained an associate and bachelor's of applied science in criminal justice. My wonderful co-host for this journey into the psyche of evildoers is TJ Stevens. TJ, tell us why you wanted to do this.
Well, my background is not nearly that impressive. I'd say in my teenage years, my mom and sister introduced me to Stephen King. Now, mind you, my mom had been reading Stephen King long before that. It's just I was old enough to start reading it myself without having nightmares the rest of my life. And it's always been a cursory interest to me. But it's increased to a fascination, especially when I was taking psychology when I was in college in 2011. And that's when you start to kind of deep dive into the human brain. And more importantly, how can it do stuff like this and justify it, which to me is the fascinating part. And people have this misconception of, oh, you're into serial killers, must be into gore. No, we don't do it for that. That's not the thing that interests. It's, for me anyway, it's more how in the brain. That's what fascinates me. My sister got me a serial killers encyclopedia, which I still have, for Christmas one year, and that was it. I was hooked. Then I learned about John Wayne Gacy, who was right up the street in Chicago. Probably the case that hooked me because of the proximity. But then there's, like we discovered last week, Bell Gunnis right here in my hometown, and there's another one that it affected my sister personally. There was a girl here in the area that my sister was in school with. Her name was Raina Risen, and she died under very mysterious circumstances in the late 80s. and it's still a very touchy subject in report to this day, because it was, I think, the final end to the case was not what people wanted or expected. It's just one of those unfortunate things. I've watched countless documentaries on serial killers and criminals and things like that, and the human brain as well. And I think this is going to make an interesting setup here. So you have the education, you have the terminology, you have the Rolodex there of the legalities of all these things. I'm just a guy that studied these a long time and is just fascinated with the human brain and the hula hoops it will put itself through to justify these terrible things. Maybe one day we'll get into what doctors are now calling the evil trinity, which is what they believe how serial killers are made. That's not for episode 2. We're going to have to save that for later. So I think it's time for you to tell us about the Gainesville Ripper.
Well, you got it. As you said, TJ, for our second episode, we're going to discuss the very first set of evil I was ever exposed to, Danny Rawling and the Gainesville murders. So these murders inspired the horror franchise Scream, as I said last week. While some have been entertained by the movie franchise, the city of Gainesville, Florida was not entertained at the least in the 1990s during Rawling's tragic killing spree. Let's start out talking about the beginning of Rawlings' life. Rawlings was born May 26, 1954 in Shreveport, Louisiana. He was born to Claudia and James Rawling. James was a local police officer at the time, while Claudia was just a young 19-year-old stay-at-home mom. Can you believe that? 19 years old, having a baby. She was a baby herself. It's been said that James served in the Korean War, so he was a war vet. Mm-hmm. Apparently, he was injured in the war and suffered from PTSD severely and on top of his injuries. So, on top of the PTSD and the injuries from the war, some state that James had a mental health issue.
Nice.
A year after Danny's birth, he had a brother that was born. His name was Kevin. Throughout his and Kevin's childhood, they were both verbally and physically abused by their father. It's just awful.
There's a lot of, and as we go through these crimes, we'll see this more and more often. We're hitting a lot of markers right now.
Yep. So this led to Danny having a rough and depressing childhood. Danny would look to the arts for ways to find relief from his home life, often finding support in music and art. Rawlings was later interviewed and stated during his teen years that he developed multiple personalities to deal with the pain and torture he was dealing with at home from his father, James.
Oh boy, that's not good.
Another marker. So it continued to go downhill from here for Danny. At the age of 18, he was kicked out of the Air Force for drug-related issues and was forced to move in with his grandfather. While living with him, he started attending church and met a woman who he would later marry, Omather Halko.
That's not a name.
No. He and Omather had a daughter in this courtship, but he drove both away, repeating the sins of his father and abuse. He abused his wife and daughter pretty much, driving both away from his life.
So what's funny is you would think that would be a common thing as well with a mind like that is abuse, because it's not horrible. I mean, it's actually very common for serial killers to have almost a second life where they can maintain allegedly a wife and kids. That's not weird at all. But you would think the abuse part would be much more prevalent. It isn't. It's actually almost the opposite.
Yeah, and I was going to say it's usually the opposite because they don't want to repeat what they had in their childhood, right? So they get off on different types of abuse. And so really he's repeating the sins of his father. Yes. And so really we learn later kind of how that kind of backfires on his father. But ultimately, many believe that Danny's first dealings with hurting someone physically outside of his family were the Gainesville murders. AllThat'sInteresting.com stated Danny raped a woman who resembled his ex-wife, Omather, and killed a woman via a car accident. The death of the woman in the car accident actually sent him further over the edge. So, believe it or not, he wasn't already over the edge by the point that the car accident happened, this actually sent him even further over the edge.
Wow.
So let's recap quickly before going further. Danny's born to a young mother who's in a relationship with someone who battles both PTSD and mental health issues. Danny's father takes out his PTSD and mental issues not only on his wife, but his two sons, both physically and mentally. Danny escapes from the house and finds stability in the military, only to be kicked out of that stability after drug issues. He moves in with Grandpa, who should be another safe haven, right? Finds the church, gets married, has a daughter, and ultimately starts repeating the sins of his father, which you would think he wouldn't, like we talked about before. So I have to ask you, TJ, let's start thinking back to our original discussion. Is someone born evil, or do they progressively grow evil over time?
Oh, I don't think anyone's born evil. I think it's manufactured. But there's so much to unpack here in this summation of his conditions. So, and we, again, the multiple personalities thing stands out to me a lot. Here's we start his bio off here. Also, for those who don't know what PTSD is like, I don't have it, but both of us know someone who does, and we'll just leave it at that. But we know someone who does, and if it's severe enough, it's almost like they become disassociated with the world. They're in battle mode all the time. Well, I shouldn't say battle mode. I should say fight or flight mode all the time. They can't shut it off. Also, what's interesting to me as I was considering this, so we mentioned, how uncommon it is for serial killers to maintain families, but yet not to abuse them. But yet Danny here is. And you said he was repeating the sins of the father, which of course, but to me, you would think he wouldn't do that, because as these things start to unwind, and this might be why other serial killers don't do this, it almost seems like it would make him more suspicious to his family as these things happen. So I was wondering in my head, do serial killers not abuse their own families out of not repeating the evils of their youth, or are they just covering their tracks? Well, I'm an angel at home, so I can't do this. I mean, it never works, mind you, but I'm just, it's quite the conundrum to consider.
Yeah, at least with his ex-wife and daughter, the shock factor wouldn't have been there, right?
Right.
I mean, he was a creep to begin with.
Yes.
So, others, they have that shock factor of, he was good man, went to church.
Ted Bundy.
Loving father, all this other stuff.
Jeffrey Dahmer was a devout Christian.
Yeah, always had people for dinner. I'm sorry.
You did that. You did that.
So let's continue. So when we last left Danny, he had just raped a woman and killed another through a car accident. Danny would spend the 70s and 80s continuing into a life of crime by burglary and other crimes throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. Probably, passing Eileen,
probably
along the way.
She was captured 90.
Yep. So Rawlings was in and out of jail and was connected to 3 murders in Shreveport, but never arrested or suspected until after arrested for the Gainsville murders. Furthermore, in the early 1990s, Rawlings went back to his home in Shreveport and actually shot his father twice, but only wounding him. So knowing that he left his father alive and the police would be after him, he left Louisiana and changed his identity as Michael Kennedy Jr. because, the Kennedy name doesn't stand out at all.
Say, why would you make your name Kennedy Jr. to be incognito?
Yep. So after leaving Shreveport, after shooting his father, he landed in Sarasota, Florida, which, if you don't know Sarasota, Florida, it's a beautiful place right near the water, a lot of beaches. So it's a beautiful location to go to. Now, a normal person would say to themselves, is this where he utilizes his new identity, turn his life around, find Jesus, and do better? TJ, we wouldn't be here talking about Danny right now if that was the case.
It's true, but I mean, technically, he's already killed 3 people. So.
If the story stopped there, we probably wouldn't have the movie franchise Scream. We wouldn't be discussing them, and 5 innocent lives would not have been taken. So 1 month after arriving in Florida, Danny ventured from Sarasota, Florida, 2 hours and 45 minutes north to Gainesville, Florida. Gainesville, the home of University of Florida, a small but beautiful town that in the 1990s was well known as a college town. For those that don't know what I mean by college town, you can definitely tell the difference when school's in session and when school's out of session. Majority of the students that attend the college aren't local and will travel home on breaks. So pretty much that town's empty when the school's not in session.
And my sister lives outside of Hillsborough, North Carolina, which is just down the road from North Carolina and Duke. So I know all about that.
Well, Gainesville was and still is special to me today, as it was the place I visited every summer to visit my grandparents and family on my mom's side. The summer of 1990, I was 10 years old and had older cousins that were of college age and female at the time. But enough about me in Gainesville. Let's get back to Danny and why we're discussing him on our podcast. On August 24th, 1990, Rawlings raped and killed his first 2 victims in Gainesville, UF freshmen Christina Powell and Sonia Larson. Rawlins wasn't done. The next day, he brutally murdered Santa Fe Community College student Krista Hoyt. With Hoyt's murder, it was like Danny was escalating. He didn't just murder her. He severed her head from her body and had it facing her body. Something out of a horror film.
Mm-hmm.
In a small college town like Gainesville, 3 murders in 2 days is huge. It's not just huge. It made the news every night. This sent the town into a panic that possible serial killer was out there. More importantly, college, which was freshly back in session, had a possible killer on campus. Labeled the Gainesville Ripper, the local media and police department worked together to set curfews and notify the citizens of Gainesville to be more cautious than normal of their surroundings. Lock their doors, watch out for themselves and their neighbors, be vigilant. Unfortunately, all of that did not help.
So before we go any further, you said something, there was a detail in there. You said that it struck me that, and some people listening to this that don't know, again, the investigation technique of all this, not that I do, but I say I have a better understanding than most, is why did he have to bring up he severed her head and faced it at her? That's an interesting question because it wasn't on accident. He did it for a reason. And I'm curious to know what that reason is.
He was sending a message to the town of Gainesville. Hey, he was here. He was a threat. And so I look at it like it's a horrible example, but like you look at Freddy Krueger, right? And Freddy Krueger starts off with a murder, right? And then it progressively gets worse. Or even like Jason, Michael Myers, you get these iconic villains, right, in the horror franchise, and they progressively escalate their murders to kind of make the audience understand, hey, I'm here, I'm a threat, don't take me lightly. And I think that's what Danny Rawlings was trying to do. On August 27th, 1990, 2 days after the last murder, Danny struck again. This time, Danny killed the last 2 victims of the Gainesville murders. It was a 23-year-old UF students, Manuel Tabata and Tracy Paulez. Danny knew at this point Gainesville Police Department and other authorities were looking for the serial killer that had caused panic and fear in the quiet small town of Gainesville. He fled. While the police investigated the murders, they started to hone in on a suspect. While we now know that it was Rawlings, the police had suspected a University of Florida college student that had lived in the same apartment complex as the 2 of the victims. Not only did he share a common residence with the 2 victims, friends of the suspect stated he had mental issues and had abused his grandmother. Wow. All signs that usually point to a serial killer, right? Abuse, mental issues, and then obviously location, right? So they're in common, they're close residency to that. So
yes,
like I said before, I had female cousins that lived there. One of them who was pregnant at the time. They both, basically said they can remember. They couldn't believe something like this was happening to their once quiet town. Furthermore, that there was nothing tying the victims together. So it was random, right? All they knew was that there was college students or college-age students. And so the nerves were heightened for those that fit the college age and the killer was targeting. They ensured that they checked in on their friends and families more than they did before and double-checked locking their doors and windows. I could just think back to those days, and I was actually in Gainesville after the murders. And even then, we were panicked, right? So you not only checked that you locked the doors, but you would also go around the house making sure that you were being the only ones that were in the house that were expected, right? And so just imagine that town living in a horror film for that time period and not knowing if the murders were done or not, right? We talk about it was his last two victims, but they didn't know that, right? So back to Rawlings. While the police were still looking for their killer, Rawlings had been caught for armed burglary and in jail an hour south in Ocala, Florida.
Dope.
Yeah. So
What a dope.
Yeah. Rawlings would sit in jail in Ocala for roughly a year before DNA from a tooth was used to match his DNA to the murders in Gainesville. So the city of Gainesville, or town of Gainesville, really panicked again for another full year because the killer had not been caught. So at any moment, a killer could strike again, not knowing that the real killer, was an hour south in Ocala, sitting in jail. Now, the interesting part about this, TJ, was the authorities were able to link Rawlings to 3 murders in Shreveport. And remember, he was still wanting for shooting his father twice while he was home. So TJ, as you can imagine, Rawlings was screwed at this point.
Yeah, and he did it to himself. I cannot tell you how many of these stories. We can go down the line. David Berkowitz got caught based off of a parking ticket he got the night of the last victim he shot. Ted Bundy, Grand Theft Auto, and the car he stole, I believe, had an expired license plate. Because, I mean, if you're going to go all out. And then there's another one that got caught under really stupid like it's always dumb shit that gets these guys caught, which is, I mean, I guess it's a good thing. It's got to be something. But what's curious to me is I want to know what happened that turned him from just another run-of-the-mill abusive dude to a spree killer, seemingly out of nowhere. That's what's weird about this story so far is he jumped so high in such a short amount of time. Like that part of it, something had to have, what they call a stressor, something in his life had to have happened around that time that was just enough to push him over the edge. And we got here because, I mean, this is severe escalation.
Yeah, I think, though, if you look at it, like he continued to escalate. So there was the abuse of his father, right?
Yeah.
He was abused. Then he goes on and repeats that same abuse to his wife and kid. And then he rapes a woman, right? So there's the escalation there. Mm-hmm. And then he kills a woman in a car accident. Now, that's an accident, right?
Right.
But still, that's a death that he's caused. So either that's the stressor that's either pushed him to that next level, but then he shoots his father twice, right?
Yep.
So he's now tasted what it feels like to injure another person twice when we're talking a car accident, and then taking a gun to his father and shooting him twice. So I think there's escalation patterns slowly. Now, he's brutal when he gets to Gainesville at that point,
yes.
right?
Yes.
So mentally, I don't know what's there, right? But ultimately,
very, very personal too.
My thought process is, and this is just an assumption, his father suffers from mental issues. Perhaps he suffered from mental issues as well. And that's where the escalation comes from. So I don't know. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the people of Florida and the families of the several victims were happy that Rawlings was finally caught and charged for the 5 murders in Gainesville in June of 1992, so almost a year and a half after, and would be later found guilty in March of 1994, sentenced to the death penalty in 1994. The unfortunate thing for the taxpayers of Florida is we had to continue to pay for the vile piece of dung for another 12 years.
So that's why I've never heard of this case before. Because do you know what else happened in March of April of 94?
No, what's that?
Outside of Roddy Piper fighting Goldust in an epic street fight, OJ.
That's right. The Bronco and everything.
Yes.
Yeah. So the only thing I forgot to point out is that Rawlings pled guilty. So even though he had admitted to all the murders because he said that he had suffered from multiple personalities that told him to do these hideous acts. So there goes to that mental health. And so I ask you again, with Danny Rawlings, is someone born evil or does it develop over time?
Again, I think it develops over time. At least that's what I hope. I mean, you hope that no one has the ability to be born a serial killer. And again, we spoke on this beginning of the show. I think now is a good time to kind of bring it back. And actually, I lied. The chase was in June. So, no, that can't. Never mind. It's not important. So, the serial killer trinity, which I first heard on an episode of My Favorite Murder, which is also a big starting block for this show, was a lot of criminologists started to see this incredibly detailed set of circumstances when the person was young, all occurred almost throughout, that led them to become who they were. And it was severe head trauma when they were young was one of them. Abuse was another one, and bedwetting. And I mean, into early teens, bedwetting, in which bedwetting is nothing to make fun of. It's a direct result of child abuse. That's how it comes to be. Those 3 things, what they call the serial killer trinity. So normally, if they experience those 3 things in their life, this will be the unfortunate circumstance. Not 100% of the time. I wouldn't even say 50, but it's enough that it has a name, and usually it starts off as animal violence. Young, if they're real young, they'll disassemble their dolls and stuff like that, and then they'll move on to animal torture, and then unfortunately we get to this. But yeah, you hope it develops over time, because at least if it develops over time, there's time to correct it if it's caught, as opposed to birth. You can't really correct birth. It's just there's no hope.
So one of the awkward things that I forgot to bring up is, so usually it does start off with the serial killer beating the dog or abusing something, right? And the opposite, the father actually constantly beat their dog, and actually beat him so bad that he actually killed the dog, and the dog actually died in Danny's arms. So basically, I think, I kept trying to look for like abuse of animals in his path, and that's the only thing I could come up with. But he would put I would put that in there as like maybe that's something that triggered him as well, back in his childhood.
I mean, if that's not a trigger, I don't know what is. That almost made me cry sitting here listening to it. I had a German Shepherd Husky mix for the entire time I grew up. He died when he was 22 years old because we put him down. He would not die. He had cancer 3 times, didn't care. And I was 26 years old when we decided to put that dog down, and it still tore me apart. I couldn't imagine being a child and watching my dad beat my dog to death in front of me, than having a dime out. Like it, no wonder. So no, he was not born this way, but he was destined to be this way in that environment. I mean, wow. Wow.
Yeah, it definitely goes to the nature versus nurture, right? And so
Yes.
his father pretty much raised him to be a serial killer based off of the actions that he did.
And unfortunately, that's not uncommon either. But it's not overwhelming. I'd say it's like 60-40. Because like John Wayne Gacy had totally normal upbringing growing up. Bundy was rather affluent growing up, similar thing. And that's the one thing about those two cases, not to steer too far from this one, but they never really explain like the jump, how you get from here to here. They just evolved into that. Well, how? I mean, Gacy started off doing sex crimes and stuff, but he never really. Again, I don't know, like that when that part's missing, and it's certainly not missing here. It is crystal clear how we got to this point in this one, but when that part's missing, it's that much more fascinating because you can't understand it. You have no information to understand it. This one, I mean, he certainly was not going to work in a factory the rest of his life. Wow. Unreal. Well, thank you for that. That was, I don't know if tremendous is the right word, but yeah, I didn't know about it. This was something else.
You're welcome. It just goes to show you that, I mean, like, there's always a story behind something, right? And so the more that we can dig and kind of understand this, the more it can potentially help us out in the future.
Yeah. Yes. And that'll be something else, as we discuss some of these cases over time. And after this one, we're going to start going into much greater detail. You will see signs repeat, and a lot. So you hear them enough times, you're like, hey, that's something I should notice. And then believe it or not, you will. Just out of listening to us drone on about it, it will trigger in your head that that's an abnormal behavior. We need to address that now before Ted Bundy Part 2 comes out here. If you enjoyed this week's episode, remember to rate and review this podcast wherever you get your podcast. As always, we look forward to making this an interactive podcast. So to that point, we have not discussed our next topics, either me or you. So ask your questions about anything we didn't cover about Danny Rowling, and also suggestions for the topics for episodes 3 and 4. Until then, that's Justin. I'm TJ. Thank you for listening to Evolution of Evil.